Imagine a general over 2,000 years ago standing before a mountain range that scraped the sky, the Alps, a frozen wall between worlds. Now imagine him saying, "We go over." To most men that would sound like madness. To Hannibal Barca, it was destiny. This is not just the story of a war. It's the story of an oath sworn by a boy before the gods of Carthage, to hate Rome for as long as he lived. The year is 218 BC. Rome is at the height of its power, disciplined, organized, unstoppable. Its armies control the Mediterranean. Its fleets dominate every sea. Across the water, the city of Carthage, once Rome's equal, now scarred from the First Punic War, watches and waits. Among its people stands a man shaped by loss and revenge, Hannibal, son of Hamilcar Barca, the legendary general who once swore that his children would never make peace with Rome. History says that when Hannibal was a child, his father made him place his hand on a sacrificial altar and repeat the vow, "I swear eternal enmity toward Rome." It wasn't a metaphor. It was the foundation of one of the boldest military campaigns in human history. While Rome looked south toward the Mediterranean, Hannibal looked north, toward the Alps. To him, those mountains weren't an obstacle. They were a weapon. Rome's power was built on its navy. Its legions could crush anyone who approached by sea. So Hannibal did what no Roman would ever expect. He went where no army had ever gone before. He would invade Italy not from the south, but from above. It was military heresy, a plan so reckless it bordered on myth. But it was also genius. If he could cross the Alps with his army intact, he would appear in northern Italy behind Roman lines, cutting through their heartland like a thunderbolt from the clouds. That was the dream, an impossible dream born from strategy, fury, and imagination. Carthage at that time wasn't the empire it once was. It was rebuilding, quietly, cleverly, far from Roman eyes. In Hispania, modern-day Spain, Hannibal was gathering an army unlike any the world had seen. African infantry hardened by desert warfare, Iberian cavalry swift as the wind, and the shock troops that would become legend, the elephants. Not circus beasts, but weapons. Massive, intelligent, unstoppable walls of muscle and ivory trained to charge through enemy ranks and shatter morale before a single sword was drawn. These elephants, the African forest breed, were smaller than their Indian cousins, but ferocious and utterly alien to Roman soldiers who had never seen such creatures before. They would be Hannibal's tanks before tanks existed. But the true brilliance wasn't the elephants themselves. It was how he planned to use them. He wasn't just bringing animals, he was bringing shock and awe. As his army assembled in Spain, his lieutenants questioned him. "Over the Alps? With elephants? With winter coming?" Hannibal simply smiled. He wasn't reckless. He was calculating. To him, the Alps weren't a mountain range. They were a flank, a way to strike where Rome was blind. The Romans believed no army could move that way. Hannibal would prove that belief wrong, not through brute force, but through audacity. He knew the risks: the snow, the avalanches, the thin mountain passes where a single rock slide could bury an army alive. He knew half his men might die before they even reached Italy. But he also knew something greater, that history doesn't remember the cautious. Before his march began, Hannibal stood before his troops, 30,000 men from Africa, Spain, and Gaul, and promised them not safety but immortality. He told them that the gods favored those who dared what others feared, and that by conquering the mountains they would conquer the future. No one had ever attempted such a crossing with a full army, let alone with war elephants. No one thought it was possible. But Hannibal wasn't trying to do the possible. He was trying to do the unthinkable. And so, in the autumn of 218 BC, as the fog rolled down the Pyrenees and the first frost touched the mountain peaks, the greatest gamble in ancient history began. Tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of horses, and 37 war elephants started the ascent toward a white, frozen wall that no army had ever crossed, and toward a destiny that would shake the foundations of Rome itself. Because Hannibal Barca wasn't just marching an army, he was marching a legend into being. Forget every story you've heard about ancient armies. This was no disciplined Roman column marching along stone roads. This was chaos, controlled only by one man's will. When Hannibal left Spain, he wasn't just leading soldiers, he was leading a civilization on the move. 30,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. The beating heart of his audacious dream. Each step north took him further from safety, deeper into legend. The first challenge wasn't the Alps, it was how to get there. Across the Pyrenees, through hostile tribes, across the icy Rhone, each crossing was a battle of endurance. Every night they built bridges of logs tied with ropes just strong enough to carry elephants across rivers that swallowed men whole. Each animal needed over 200 pounds of food a day, and yet there was none to spare. They marched through wastelands where even grass froze to the ground. The men suffered in silence. The elephants did not. They bellowed through the fog, the sound echoing through valleys like thunder. It wasn't just an army advancing. It was nature itself being dragged forward by sheer human defiance. These weren't the massive Indian elephants of legend. They were smaller, African forest elephants, temperamental, unpredictable, and easily frightened. To keep them calm, the handlers sang to them. To keep them moving, they blinded them from the cliffs ahead. And when a beast panicked on a narrow pass, it wasn't just a danger, then it was a disaster. One slip, and a dozen soldiers could fall to their deaths. Hannibal's men learned that courage wasn't a shout. It was one step at a time on ice-slick rock with an animal that could crush you if it stumbled. The army that Hannibal commanded was unlike any in the ancient world. Africans, Numidians, Spaniards, Gauls, men who didn't share a language but shared a purpose. To march with Hannibal wasn't a contract. It was a vow. He kept discipline not through fear but through faith, in himself, and in the impossible dream he had promised. They didn't fight for Carthage anymore. They fought for him. When the supplies ran out, they ate what they could find. Roots, bark, frozen grain. They drank melted snow mixed with wine to keep their blood warm. The air itself froze in their lungs. Men's fingers blackened, their sandals split, yet they pressed on. Because behind them was starvation, and ahead of them, immortality. Imagine that sight. An endless line of men and beasts crawling up into the clouds, dwarfed by cliffs that blotted out the sun. The snow blinding, the wind cutting through armor. Frost biting into elephant skin. Shields rimed with ice. Oars and pikes used as crutches to climb the frozen slopes. It wasn't an army anymore. It was a moving monument to willpower. At night, fires flickered across the mountainsides like constellations on Earth. The soldiers wrapped themselves in wet furs, sleeping in shifts beside dying flames. The elephants huddled together, steaming in the cold. Above them, the sky burned with unfamiliar stars, the same stars that guided them to war. Hannibal, always at the front, walked among his men barefoot in the snow to prove he was one of them. He shared their rations, their frost, their exhaustion. To them, he was not a general. He was a storm, a man whose conviction burned hotter than the fires that kept them alive. Somewhere deep in those mountains, legend says, he turned back to his officers and said, "We will find a way, or we will make one." It was not a boast, it was a prophecy. Because on the other side of that frozen hell, beyond the cliffs and the blizzards, waited the prize that had haunted his family for generations. Rome. The higher they climbed, the smaller the world became. The forests disappeared first, then the grass, until only ice and wind remained. There were no roads here, only scars in the rock, and still Hannibal marched. What began as an army was now a test of faith. The air thinned, the snow deepened, and the sky turned a merciless white. Men could no longer tell where the earth ended and the clouds began. And through it all came the sound of chains, hooves, and the deep rumble of elephants dragging themselves through the void. By the 10th day, the mountain itself had turned against them. Avalanches roared down without warning, burying men and supplies beneath walls of snow. Whole columns vanished in seconds. The living dug for the dead until their hands bled. The path was so narrow that a single misstep could send horses and soldiers tumbling thousands of feet into mist. Even the gods, it seemed, wanted Hannibal to fail, but he did not stop. Each morning before the march began, Hannibal would stand at the edge of the cliff and look east, toward Italy. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, and that was enough. The Celtic tribes who lived among the peaks saw him as an intruder and a threat. They watched from the rocks, waiting. At night they attacked, swift, brutal, invisible in the snow. Arrows hissed from above, rolling boulders shattered men and beasts alike. The mountain echoed with screams and iron. By dawn, the attackers were gone, their shadows lost among the glaciers. Hannibal's response was not rage, it was patience. He divided his army using feigned retreats to draw the tribes into ambushes of his own. Even in this frozen nightmare, his mind was a weapon sharper than any sword. For every mile of mountain, he fought 2 battles, one against man and one against nature. Then came the legend. Somewhere near the summit, the path was blocked by sheer rock, an unbreakable wall of stone. The elephants could go no further. Turning back meant death. So Hannibal ordered something no commander had ever dared before. They built fires against the cliff until the rock glowed red, then poured vinegar over it to crack the stone with steam and shock. Whether this story is myth or miracle, no one knows. But the mountain broke, and when the smoke cleared, the path was open. The survivors marched on, hollow-eyed, frostbitten, moving through a world of white silence. They had lost half their number. The elephants stumbled, their skin split from the cold, their breath visible in the thin air. Men carried those too weak to walk. Discipline had given way to instinct, and still they moved forward. When they reached the highest pass, Hannibal ordered a halt. From there, through the fog, his men could finally see the green valleys of Italy below. Some wept, others fell to their knees. They had crossed the roof of the world and lived. Hannibal looked down from that summit and told his soldiers, "You have fought nature itself and won. Rome will be no harder." It was not arrogance, it was survival speaking through frost and blood. The army that descended the Alps was not the one that entered them. It was smaller, harder, silent. They had seen death in its purest form, not on the battlefield, but in the endless cold where even the sun offered no warmth. When they finally reached the plains of northern Italy, the locals fled at the sight of them, men with frozen faces, hollow eyes, and beasts that looked carved from ice. They were ghosts out of legend, and behind them lay the mountain that no army had ever crossed, until Hannibal. He had done the impossible. He had outwitted Rome, outlasted nature, and outlived the odds. But what awaited him beyond those green fields would be a new kind of war, one against the greatest army on earth. Because while he had conquered the mountains, Rome was still waiting. When Hannibal and his men finally descended from the Alps, the world they entered was almost unreal. The snow gave way to grass, the silence to birdsong. For the first time in weeks, they could feel the warmth of the sun on their faces, but what that sun revealed was devastating. Of the 50,000 who had marched into the mountains, fewer than half remained. Many were frostbitten, starving, barely human. The elephants, once towering symbols of power, were shadows of themselves, their ribs showing, their eyes dim. Yet they had made it. And in doing so, they had done what no one thought possible. When word reached Rome that a foreign army, led by elephants, had emerged in northern Italy, panic spread faster than fire. It wasn't supposed to happen. The Alps were meant to be a wall, not a doorway. And now, through that doorway came the most feared general of the ancient world. Hannibal didn't march like an invader. He moved like a phantom. He slipped through valleys and forests, gathering allies among the Gallic tribes who despised Roman rule. Every step south was a psychological strike, proof that even the gods seemed to favor him. The Romans, proud and unshaken for centuries, finally met him on the battlefield, at the river Trebia. The air was freezing, the ground soaked from days of rain. The Roman commanders, certain of victory, charged headlong into Hannibal's trap. What followed was chaos and brilliance. Hannibal drew them in with his cavalry, then unleashed hidden troops from the reeds and riverbanks. His elephants crashed through the Roman lines like living battering rams, their tusks smeared with ash to terrify horses. By nightfall, the river ran red. Tens of thousands of Romans were dead. Hannibal had not only survived the Alps, he had conquered his first Roman army on Italian soil. But his genius didn't stop there. 2 years later, in 216 BC at Cannae, he achieved what modern generals still study as the perfect battle. Outnumbered and surrounded, Hannibal deliberately allowed the Roman army to press into his center. Then, with one synchronized movement, he closed the trap, his cavalry circling from behind, his infantry pressing from both sides. It was a masterpiece of timing and deception, a double envelopment that annihilated an army twice his size. 70,000 Romans died in a single day. It remains one of the deadliest battles in history. A slaughter so total that Rome banned public mourning for fear the city itself would collapse in despair. And yet Hannibal didn't march on Rome. He didn't need to. He had already broken it, not by fire but by fear. Rome no longer believed itself invincible. For 15 years, Hannibal roamed Italy like a storm that would not end. He won battle after battle, outthinking every general they sent against him. Even as his army dwindled, his legend grew. The Romans began to whisper his name as if it were a curse. Mothers would quiet their children by saying, "Hannibal is at the gates." It became more than a warning. It became an idea, a reminder that no power, no matter how mighty, is untouchable. But time, not tactics, would become his enemy. Without reinforcements from Carthage, Hannibal's army thinned. The elephants died one by one. His veterans aged on foreign soil, their victories turning to ghosts. Rome, learning from its wounds, began to adapt, building new commanders, new strategies. They copied his speed, his maneuver, his unpredictability. They became the very thing they feared. By the time Hannibal finally withdrew from Italy, he had changed the art of war forever. He had shown the world that genius could defy geography, that courage could outlast the impossible, and that strategy, true strategy, is not about strength, but about imagination. Generals from every century that followed would study his campaigns, Napoleon, Wellington, Patton, all tracing the same pattern of deception, speed, and surprise that Hannibal had written in blood and ice. His march was no longer just a story. It was a blueprint. Because while Rome would go on to rule the world, it would always live with the memory of one man who had nearly undone it. A man who turned the Alps into a weapon, elephants into engines of fear, and himself into a legend carved into the mountains he conquered. The March of Hannibal wasn't just a military campaign, it was a mirror, reflecting what human beings can do when the world tells them something is impossible. Most wars are remembered for who won, but this one, for who dared. Because Hannibal didn't just fight Rome, he fought nature, he fought physics, he fought the very idea of limits, and for a moment he won. What he accomplished was more than a victory of arms, it was a triumph of vision. To look at the Alps, a wall of ice and death, and see a pathway. To take beasts never meant for the cold and turn them into weapons of terror. To lead an army across the edge of the known world not for conquest, but for the chance to rewrite destiny. That isn't strategy. That's imagination weaponized. Hannibal's genius wasn't that he commanded men. It was that he made them believe the impossible could be done. He turned fear into fuel. He transformed hardship into momentum, and he did it without maps, without machines, only will. But his story isn't just about glory, it's also about cost. For every mile he gained, men froze and starved. Every victory left his army smaller, his country weaker, his own fate darker. When the war ended, Hannibal would live as an exile, hunted by the same powers he once terrified. He died far from home. But his legend never did. History remembers him not for how he died, but for how far he was willing to go to keep his promise. An oath sworn as a child became a road carved across mountains. And that road still stands, invisible but eternal, in every act of defiance against the impossible. Modern generals still study his tactics, but leaders of nations, companies, and movements study something deeper, his vision. Because Hannibal proved that strategy isn't about strength, it's about seeing the map differently. It's about asking, what if, when everyone else says, you can't. Every innovator, every explorer, every dreamer who has ever faced a wall higher than their courage, they all share that same spark, that refusal to accept the obvious. When Hannibal said, we will find a way or we will make one, he wasn't just speaking to his soldiers. He was speaking to every generation that would come after. The story of Hannibal is not the story of a man who conquered Rome. It's the story of a man who conquered fear. Because long after the armies vanished and the empires fell and the elephants turned to dust, one truth remained. The greatest battles are not fought on maps. They're fought in the mind. And sometimes, it's the impossible road that leads to immortality.